All right, good evening, everyone. This is Herb Atchison, the mayor of the city of Westminster. At this point, I would ask the city clerk to go ahead and take the roll. Ms. Fitch, if you would, please.
Mayor Atchison.
Here.
Councilor DeMott.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Seitz.
Here.
Councilor Seymour.
Here.
Councilor Scully.
Here.
Councilor Smith.
Present.
And Councilor Bowles. Councilor Bowles, you appear to be muted.
Hang on a minute, Abby, and I'll check on it.
Okay, thank you.
Abby, according to Mr. Bowles, he said it's muted by organizer.
Councilor Bowles, you speak now. Councilor Bowles, if you're on your headset, could you check and make sure your headset is not muted? Because I show you're not muted on our end.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Huh, that's really weird. Okay. Well, you can hear me then. So thank you. I'm here. I don't know what's going on. There's something that says, it keeps popping up saying muted by organizer.
If you get to a point where you can't hear or you're trying to speak and we're not recognizing you, let us know.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
John.
you, Councilor Bowles.
All right, again, this is the June 15th Westminster City Council study session. All council members are present. Based on a previous roll call, all senior staff members that are required to be here for tonight, the city manager and city attorney are all present on the call on a listen-only mode. We'll try to get through some of the preliminaries as soon as we can. We have 3 items to get through tonight as far as presentations. I've asked the staff, based upon where we are with Senate Bill 217, to give us a readout on that. The city manager has indicated that will be done under the city manager's report. So when we get to that point, he'll give us an update. A couple of things that have happened over the weekend or today I want to bring to the attention of council. As we've said, one of our big issues is we want to always try to make sure that our health departments in both Adams and Jefferson County stay in sync with the variances or the requirements they have so that the city is not under a situation which we are today of having 2 different directives in effect. So over the weekend, I talked to the Adams County manager and to the director of Tri-County. Last week, Jefferson County received an approval from the state on a number of variances. The variance request they submitted was over 100 pages. Late this afternoon, I saw a portion of what the differences were, which is now still looking like it's going to keep us out of sync between Adams and Jefferson County. So at the request of the county manager, I'm advising the city council that I'm going to have staff prepare a letter to Tri-County asking them to, and Adams County, to submit a variance that puts us in line with Jefferson County as well. That way we're not going to have 2 different sets of orders that we're trying to interpret for our businesses or people trying to do business in the city, and ask them to do that on an expedited basis so we can try to get that back in sync as quickly as we can so we're not impacting people trying to operate business. I've also spoke to the county manager to see if we've got any guidance yet on things like theaters opening And at this point, we did not. So I've asked the city manager this morning to reach out to our economic development office and ask them to connect with both the Alamo Draft House and AMC Theaters and see if there's anything we can do in a variance request to try to get them to some level of opening. The city manager has indicated that he'll have economic development reach out to them and talk to them. That may or may not be included in the variance request, depending upon what the theaters tell John Hall and his team. But at this time, because we are in a situation of non-compliance in one part of the county, in one county, in compliance with what the other county is doing, I'm going to go ahead and ask the city manager to try to get this done as quickly as possible. If there's any member of the city council that objects to this process, please let me know now before we try to get this letter started. Ms. Smith, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was just wondering what some of the variances were that were different from each county that were significant enough for us to say that they should be similar. I'm in agreement that they should be the same. I'm just curious what would be different.
I don't have the 100-page variance, Ms. Smith, in front of me, but the city staff will be looking to make sure that they can identify what the ones are. Some of it has to do with occupancy. Some of it has to do with business openings. It's enough that we're now in a position where Adams County is not as open as Jefferson County is. And we want to try to make sure we can get everything as open as they are.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, Ms. Seitz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a quick question. I was wondering if we could get a copy of the letter as soon as it's drafted and sent, so we're able, if we get questions from Adams County representatives, we can answer them intelligently. And then we don't have concerns that there is a meaningful difference when it comes to protection of public health between the two. We feel very comfortable that the leniency that we're requesting in our Adams County portion is warranted by the data, and matching Jeffco makes sense for Westminster residents. Am I correct in that assumption?
That's correct. Our numbers are actually different between the two counties. And right now, Jefferson County has a worse record than Adams County does as of this morning, but that's subject to change on a daily basis. But as soon as they get it drafted, the draft will be sent out to council before I sign it, before it goes to the county. But the letter was requested by the county manager to give him some basis to try to go for the variance. Any other questions in regard to the letter to the county or to Tri-County Health? All right, Mr. Tripp, if you can work with staff to get that letter to us so that we can see it as soon as possible. The other thing to bring forward that came out today is we all recall that June is Pride Month, and today the Supreme Court affirmed that the federal civil rights law of 1964 does protect gay, lesbian, and transgender workers as far as employment. That then brings it into compliance with what we as a welcoming city, as we welcome anyone and everyone within our city. So we are especially prideful that they found this month to be the time that they've confirmed that law, and that solves a number of lower court opinions by them taking that move. The governor also over the weekend, and in a piece that he released this morning, did modify the eviction order. It did expire over the weekend. His modified order only requires that landlords now give 30 days notice on an eviction versus the previous 10 days. The order says no late fees or penalties, and he is recommending, not requiring, that the Department of Local Affairs assist with landlords and tenants to work out a payment plan, but the payment plan must be associated with COVID impact, not just any issue that they're having. It has to be a COVID impact that's requiring the payments not to be made. Again, this is a recommendation that he made to the Department of Local Affairs, not a requirement. We did hear some indication from the governor's office today that he is looking at the next phase of Safer at Home, which will be called Protect Your Neighbor. We're anticipating an announcement from the governor's office later this week as to whether or not he's going to move to that next phase, and if so, what that next phase will be. We do not have any details of what he's going to release at this point because they're still working it out. Late this afternoon, I received the agenda from CML. As we discussed a week or two ago, our representative will be Councilor DeMott. I will ask that I sent that information over to Michelle Parker late this afternoon. We have the list and bios of the candidates. Ms. Fitch, since Ms. Parker, I know, was having connection problems earlier, would you get with her to make sure that that's contained in next week's package so that the council will be able to take a position for support of not only Mr. DeMott being the person casting the ballot on behalf of Westminster, but so that the staff or council will know who all the candidates are and we can voice our opinions on each of the candidates. There are about 4, maybe 5 categories of people who are voting, and this is for candidates from across the state to be on the CML board. So I'll ask the city staff to include that in the package that goes out for next week.
Sure thing, Mayor.
That's the only thing that I have for the council at this time. I'll move to the council members. If anyone has any items they'd like to bring up before we go to the city manager. Mr. DeMott.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to report I had the Inclusivity Board met this last week. They discussed a lot of the current situations going on, from the situation with George Floyd and some other related topics. They are working on a letter of their own to put a statement out. There was a committee who had met and brought forward a first draft. The group really wanted to go back and take another crack at basically how they wanted it to be phrased and do some tweaking to that letter. So I anticipate that probably will be sent over to council once they're done with it. I'm not sure when they're going to do that second committee meeting. The other thing that they had spoken about was talking about policy in light of recent incidents, as far as like possible recommendations with the police department that group would have. They had a document that they were working on. I'm not sure if they gave that to staff yet or not, but I also know that they were told that the chief was planning on visiting them in July, so they were grateful for that. And so that was basically the summary of their meeting.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yep.
Any other members of council have any reports they want to make? Ms. Scully, I'll ask you to try to do the event that we attended earlier this past week with the at the MAC. Would you like to report on that?
Yes, sir. I would like to report on that. So on Thursday morning, the mayor and I were able to attend the autonomous vehicle demonstration from the MAC to Growing Home. It was very, very cool to see a vehicle that drives itself essentially from point A to point B. And this vehicle was taking the food that's been collected through the Front Porch Project and delivering it from the MAC all the way over to Growing Home. And then Growing Home will, of course, distribute that food to needy families in our community who are struggling with food insecurity. So it was a very exciting event, a lot of people in attendance, but all socially distanced and wearing masks. And by the way, I forgot to take my mask off whenever a picture was taken, so I am smiling under all those masks.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other members of council have any reports from the past week? All right, seeing none. Mr. Tripp, can we move to you, please?
Yes, Mr. Mayor and Mayor Pro Tem, members of council. In a moment, I'm going to pass this to the staff that have been involved with the state legislation discussion and to provide status on that discussion on police reform and ask them to make some comments and to provide you some information about that impact on policing in our community. Before I do that, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, because of the time that we're in and there being a lot of interest in this particular subject, I just want to express as your city manager responsible for the police department activities for appointing the chief and recommending a budget to you every year in my 5.5 years in this position, how proud I am of our police department and their activities, and in particular, the very difficult times that we've had in some very difficult crime, and the way they've handled themselves with professionalism, and how that builds confidence. And that confidence has been built over decades here in this city. I find a city that where the citizenry has great confidence and looks at their police department as partners. And I credit that to years and years of a number of things, going back to the Citizen Academy, I think, which has been important, but to a long tenure of city councils providing support to our police department. I know in my time, which has been about 5.5 years, there have been remarkable policy decisions that have been supported by our city council at a staffing level with pay that was necessary to be competitive, related to pension, and then specifically related to the equipment, the training, the vehicles, technology, all intended to support our police department. They're a very creative agency. They're in the midst right now of implementing on a program that you folks approved at a council for some mental health assistance. So I just really wanted to reiterate that tonight and say that I believe that our residents' trust is well-founded. But I will also acknowledge that there's a concern across America with things that we've seen on television and many, many incidents over a long period of time of relationships between police and members of our community. We have received recently some emails about national discussions that have been termed quote unquote defunding police. I think it's another way of saying police reform. And the emails that we've gotten that I've received that have been addressed to myself, most have been addressed also to the city council, seem to indicate that our city is in the midst of some sort of a investigation or study related to police reform and police defunding. In fact, the subject line on some of the emails we've received says that. There is no discussion of that type going on. I will tell you that police reform speaks to a need to make an immediate change. Police reform in our organization has gone on every day over a very long period of time. And I'm proud that our police department has been open to public input. So having said that, these emails that I'm receiving, I'm trying to figure out a way to respond and to hear those emails. And I want to do that, as I know our chief and our staff do. So because I've been brought into it and because I do have responsibility for the staff that's in the police department and for making budget recommendations to you, we're going to engage and listen to people and learn as much as we can about how people in our community want our police department to continue to serve them moving forward. But I will say that I think there's a long history of great service, and I thank those people who put their lives on the line and all of the people in our city organization who provide support to them. So having said that and provided a little bit of that background, I think I'll turn it to our staff, and I'm not sure who's going to lead. I know that Assistant City Manager Lindsay is responsible for policy. It may be him or somebody from that group. So go ahead.
Don, this is Chris Lindsay, and I'm happy to jump right in here. Good evening, Mayor and Council. This is Assistant City Manager Chris Lindsay. The Mayor asked for a readout of the police legislation that we've been tracking, so I wanted to provide you just a brief overview of the final bill because it had a large number of iterations over the past 2 weeks. So I'm just going to jump right in. The acceptable use of deadly force has been considerably narrowed. The bill bans the use of chokeholds under any circumstances. The bill moves the bill enacts a duty to intervene for a police officer that witnesses misconduct. The bill makes police officers personally liable for damages and injunctive relief for violations up to $25,000 when the employer determines that the officer acted in good faith. And law enforcement agencies must indemnify officers for damages and attorney fees. Body cameras are a large portion of the bill. Body-worn cameras are mandatory by July 1, 2023 for officers during interactions with the public. Undercover officers are exempt. A failure to activate or tamper with a body-worn camera results in a permissive inference in any investigation, except a criminal proceeding against an officer, that the footage would have reflected misconduct against the officer. Footage from a camera must be released within 21 days of an incident when there's a complaint of misconduct. Officers must have a legal basis for making a contact with someone, and by January 1, 2023, law enforcement agencies must report to the state on all uses of force, including perceived demographic information, and the officer involved and the type of force used. That's a really quick overview. We've got a number of staff that has worked quite a bit of time over this over the past 2 weeks that is available to answer questions if we can on this evening. We can get back to you on any others. I would like to thank all of them for the work they've put in over the past 2 weeks. And I would also like to thank our legislative delegation, especially Representative Shannon Bird. She really worked with us as this bill came to passage in the House over the last week.
And it's my understanding that as soon as this reaches the governor's desk, which may be yet today, that the governor is prepared to sign it.
That's what we understand.
All right. Council, anyone have any specific questions they'd like to try to get resolved? Other than the fact this is going to be a financial piece that we're going to have to deal with. And I will presume, Mr. Tripp, that we'll start looking at how we're going to fund this going forward so that we're in compliance with the law by 2023.
Yes, certainly, immediately.
All right, Mr. DeMott, you had a question.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just curious, and you probably can't answer this today, but what I would be interested to see is how much of this actually kind of a list side by side of what we're already doing versus what we're being required to do, because I know, across the country as different organizations look to do reform, some departments such as ours, I think, are already doing some of the things that, were listed in that state bill. So, and it did sound like you were going to give us a further review at some point, but will that include kind of a list of, what changes actually impact us specifically? Because I would like to know that, and I think it would be good for our residents to understand some of the things that we already do as an organization.
Councilor DeMott and Mayor, I'll jump in and answer that. Thank you for the question. Yes, the answer is yes. And for any of the rest of the councilors, if there are particular pieces of information that would help you as you discuss this matter in the community, we would be more than happy to provide that. I've already tried to begin to put together some of the things that you referred to, Councilor DeMott, because I think for some of our citizens, it would help them to understand more about our processes. And as I'm sure you'd agree, and others, we really want to emphasize to people that are listening that if you have an interest in how we're policing in our community, to get involved in the Citizens Academy. That's an outstanding opportunity to really get into the detail of what our police department do to train and how and the policies that we have to keep our community safe.
Thank you for that, Mr. Tripp. I would agree with what you just said. I think one of the interesting things that I've heard in the community since the idea of defunding has come up, and I will say, I think that your statement earlier hits it for some people. Some people it is about reform. Some people, I have actually been straight told that they think that the right thing would be basically not a traditional police department, which I don't agree with at all. But I think that there's a good opportunity for people to understand what our department does. One of the areas specifically that I know our council added to the strategic plan in my time is mental health, and making sure that we have resources. And I know that the chief just recently worked on some extra mental health things. So I think that those things will be beneficial as we go down this discussion and try to answer the concerns of the citizens. So thank you.
Ms. Scully?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I want to thank City Manager Don Tripp for mentioning the Citizens Academy and really emphasizing the prospect of being a participant in the Citizens Academy. Many of us on the City Council have taken advantage of that opportunity. I think it's a real eye opener to how our police department operates and what the thoughts are behind what they do and how they're constantly reevaluating and looking at what they do and how they do it and its purpose and how to be better at it. And I'm proud to say that makes me happy. I also really believe in education. I believe in getting to know about things before you pass judgment. So I encourage people to be a part of our Citizens Academy, join it, take the opportunity to learn about the police department. With that said, I had some questions. There were some things in this initial legislative bill that did concern me as well. And one of them is that this really seemed to only apply to municipality. I didn't see a lot of county and I didn't see a lot of state application. Can anybody, Chris, Lindsay, maybe could you address that for me? Did that get included in the bill? I know it was a concern from our own department, and I'm just curious if that got included or it just went without it.
Catherine, I can tell you that it now includes all law officers in the state, from the state all the way down.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I really do appreciate that. The other thing that I would be interested in, I appreciate Councilor Demont saying that he would like to see how we do meet some of the requirements and what we'll be doing to move forward. But I'm also curious how surrounding communities around us meet and are moving forward, just to learn from maybe what they already know, what they're doing, what their recommendations are. If there's any way we could gather that information as well, I would certainly appreciate it. I know that as our police department does not currently have the cams, but I'd be curious to know what surrounding communities do and what they've learned from those experiences, just out of curiosity. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Other comments or questions from any member of the council at this time? Just as a short side note, if you happen to look through the bill, you will see that the funding for the state patrol, the money for that was taken from the Highway Users Trust Fund, which is transportation dollars for the state. So whatever they're going to spend is going to be coming out of a transportation fund. Ms. Seitz, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I initially was going to defer because my colleagues did a really good job asking questions and also kind of highlighting what we're currently doing. I did want to, based off of your last comment, I did want to ask though about the specific fiscal impact to Westminster, if there's any state assistance, including but not limited to perhaps facilitating group purchasing, data collection or data storage and collection opportunities to do that maybe with partners. And then I really liked Councilor Demont's question about comparing the bill with what we're currently doing. We've also received a lot of citizen or resident, rather not citizen, questions asking us to employ or prohibit certain actions. It's about 8 or 9 long, and I know I forwarded it over to staff. I would love a synopsis of what we're already doing, so I can be help educate our community, but also educate myself as to how Westminster is already kind of leading in this area. I do know that we have put a lot of thought and we're constantly looking to improve, but I would like to compare with the requests we've received from citizens where we're at today. And that's all I have. Thank you.
All right. If there are no other questions on this subject, Mr. Tripp, let's get the rest of your report then, please.
Well, thank you, Mayor, but that's it. That's all I have for this evening. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the first presentation of the 2019 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. Mr. Tripp, you have anyone going to tell us about finances?
Yes, this is in Deputy Dorr's area. I think he's got the Finance Director, Tammy Hitchens, queued up, and he may make some comments as well.
All right, Mr. Dorr, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mayor, members of City Council, Larry Dorr, Chief Financial Officer and Deputy City Manager. I just want to introduce Tammy Hitchens, who will describe some of the activities surrounding the 2019 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. She also has the auditor, Marcy Arden from BKD, who on the line here tonight, who will have a couple of comments as well. I just want to thank Tammy, and I want to thank Marcy for everything that's gone into this year's audit. It's always quite a huge feat to pull off. And one of the challenges that a team of accountants has is, they have their recurring activities throughout the day, the week, the year, and then the preparation of the audit work papers is something that sort of piles on top. And I know that Tammy will have some additional thanks for the rest of the team that contributed to this year's successful audit. So Tammy, if you would take it away with Marcy, and thanks so much again for all of your work on the audit.
Thank you, Mr. Dorr, and thank you, Mayor and Council, for giving me the opportunity to talk about our financial statements. As Mr. Dorr just said, audits are always very difficult to do, not necessarily from the work itself, although sometimes that is part of it, but because of just how much work is required to go into an audit. And as Larry mentioned, a lot of times it's kind of done more on your own time as opposed to city time because of the actual day-to-day operations that need to go on. Add to that a little pandemic, and this year it proved to be extra challenging because we did everything remotely. We worked with BKD, and I do want to thank Marcy and her team for working with us in the best way that we could work together to get through this audit, which included a lot of scanning and a lot more electronics documentation than we've ever done, and we got through it, and it was like I said, a little challenging. Add to that, in addition to a pandemic, add the fact that GASB thought that we needed to have, I think, 3 more statements that we had to implement this year. And anyway, it was a pretty challenging year for us. Having said that, Sherry Sanchez, who is our accounting manager, she led a group of our auditors and other folks in the finance staff who really did a great job going through it. I'll say it probably wasn't as smooth as it's been in the prior years, and I think Marcy's going to probably talk a little bit more about that. The bottom line, though, is we did have an unmodified audit opinion. There is a management letter that Marcy will talk about a little bit later during the presentation. But I'm going to start off with going through the what I thought was important. And for those of you who've been on council for a while, you've seen these slides. They're slightly different because of some of the GASBs that we had, but it's also good to be able to consistently see and how things have changed over the years, so they'll look very familiar to you. And so with that, if we could go to the next slide, please, Matt. So we have in the CAFR, we've got what we call government-wide financial statements as well as fund financial statements. And so what we've done is from the government-wide financial statements, we have what they call governmental activities, and they have business type activities. Business type activities are what you would think of. We have the golf courses as well as the utility. Those are our business type activities. Our governmental funds include our general fund, sales and use tax fund, parks, open space and trails, capital projects, the community development block grant fund, debt service, the Westminster Economic Development Authority, the Housing Authority, our Conservation Trust, which is the lottery proceeds that we get, as well as investigation recoveries in all of the general improvement districts. The significant thing about the government-wide statements is they try to combine everything for the city on a consolidated basis. The breakdown, though, is of course the business type versus the governmental type. We at the city, we have what we call internal service funds. Those are the funds that would, if we could go outside the organization and like purchase insurance, but we're self-insured. So that's one of our internal service funds. We make sure that we can eliminate interfund activities, so we're not accounting for those twice. And then that we, as part of this in the governmental wide activities, as opposed to the fund statements, we do show our long-term assets, our capital assets, which include infrastructure, and long-term liabilities, which includes debt. And this year, one of the GASBs that we had to implement was GASB 84. And GASB stands for the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, and that is our organization that basically says how we have to present some of our financial information. And so one of the GASBs, number 84, had us add back fiduciary funds. And I say add back because at one point in time, we did have our fiduciary funds in our financial statements. And over the years, that's changed. It's changed to where they became kind of footnotes, and then they kind of left altogether, and now they're back again. And one of the maybe frustrating things about GASB itself, I guess in June this year, so any time now, they're probably going to take pension funds like we have, which is a 401(a) contribution fund for all of our employees who are not in the Fire and Police Pension Association. And they're going to basically make it so that we no longer have to do this. So basically, you're going to probably see this fiduciary fund in here for this year. Next year, we'll probably be taking it back out. I guess the good news, it's easier to take out than put in. So anyway, and then we get into the fund financial statements, and those are a little bit different. Probably the big thing is if you're looking at a general fund, you don't see the capital assets per se, you don't see the debt. And of course, they're a little bit different in the way that they're actually recognizing how and when we recognize revenue and expenses. Next slide, please. So going to the government-wide financial statements, there's two. The statement of net position. This has the statement of net position is very similar to a balance sheet. It reflects our assets, our deferred outflows, along with liabilities and deferred inflows. And the difference of those two are net position. Over time, increases or decreases in the net position are one indicator of whether our financial health is improving or deteriorating. In addition, we have a statement of activities, and this is similar to an income statement. It presents information showing how the city's net position actually changed. All changes in net position are reported as soon as the underlying event giving rise to the change occurs, regardless of the timing of the related cash flows. And the statement of activities reflects the net cost by functional category, showing what is being supported by general government revenues. Next slide, please. So here we have the net position of the governmental activities. So for the governmental activities, our net position increased by 32 million in 2019. Making up the largest part of those changes are sales taxes, which is increased by 2.1, use taxes by 2.7 million. Our property tax increment increased by 1.8 million, and we had interest of 2.8 million. And then we did have a sale of some property that was held for resale in the downtown, and that was 6.4 million. Again, governmental activities does include the Westminster Economic Development Authority Fund. Looking at this, you can see that our net position has restricted portion of it. That is equivalent to 23.9 million. And of that, 7.6 million is restricted for capital projects, while 5.7 is restricted for our Tabor Reserve, and then 6.5 million is reserved for improvements in open space conservation. The unrestricted portion of our net position increased 22.4 million. Governmental activities, as I mentioned, altogether increased 16.2 million from 2018. And then our governmental activities expenses increased 17.5 million. And that can be broken down as public safety, 2.2 million, community development, 600,000, public works, 1.9 million, general government, 9.3 million, which includes central charges, which includes like our insurances and pension contributions and everything for all employees, regardless of which fund that they're in. Economic development increased 2 million, as well as did, Parks and Recreation increased about 1.9 million. Moving on to the next slide, we take a look at our business type activities. In here, this again, as I mentioned, this is a combination of our golf course and our utility fund. Having said that, our business activities is just overpowered by the utility fund since it's such a large fund relative to our golf course. Our net position increased 32.3 million from 2018. And then part of that, tap fees and contributions were 17 million. Other increases over 2018 included charges for services of 4.4 million, capital grants and contributions of 2.5, and interest of 1.6. Our capital assets increased 31.2 million, and our long-term liabilities increased 36.6 million, attributable to the 2019 revenue bonds that we issued towards the end of 2019. Which leads us into our outstanding debt picture. This actually coincides with what I just said. You can see where the utility fund debt increased over 2018 by the net debt increased 36.5 million. This included pay down of our normal debt, but then the issuance of the 2019 bonds. Our governmental activities debt decreased by a net of 15.9. So I think we had a little over $1 million in some leases that came on board, but the rest of it, we really were paying down our governmental activities debt. And that decreased by 15.9 million overall. Going to the next slide. This slide makes me very happy. It's one that over the years has had a lot of interfund borrowing on it. And so now we're down to basically one loan. This is a loan from the General Capital Improvement Fund to WIDA, and in particular, the Holly Park URA. It's our anticipation that this loan will be paid by property tax increment. The land that was sold to Urban Land Conservancy, once that affordable housing development begins, as well as the project that I don't remember what the name of it is now, but it was formerly referred as the St. Mark's project. We believe that we'll be getting some property tax increment from both of those. And when we get those, we'll be able to pay back the General Capital Improvement Fund. Obviously, as of the end of 2019, both of those projects were in various states. I know that just driving by, you can see where the dirt is being moved on the St. Mark's project, whereas the Urban Land Conservancy is, I think, recently come looking to be able to wait a little bit while longer. So moving to the next slide, we're going to talk about our net property, plant, and equipment. We actually had a decrease in our governmental activities assets. Our depreciation expense is nearing $20 million a year. We did have some significant additions, though. We had 8.6 million in culture and recreation, and breaking that down a little bit, we had 2.2 for trails, 1.1 million for the downtown Westminster parks and streetscapes, and then $800,000 for open space land acquisition. We also had 5.4 million in public works projects, of which 3.3 was for arterial roadways, 0.8 for the North Huron Interceptor, and 700,000 for bridge and pedestrian railing repairs. From a business type activities, we had a 31.2 million increase in our assets. And that we actually have a depreciation expense of over $15 million in our business type activities. Of note, we had 12.2 million come on the books with respect to the Big Tri Creek wastewater treatment facility biosolids project. 7.9 million of sewer main capacity increase and repairs. 6.7 million in our pressure zone 3 expansion. 5.5 million in our water meter replacements, and 5 million in Wattenberg water storage facility.
Ms. Hitchens, I need you to
Yes.
pause for a minute. We've lost one of the council members.
Okay.
Hello,
Okay.
everyone. I'm back.
All right, go ahead, Tammy.
Okay, so on this particular slide, this goes back to our governmental activities. Again, this is kind of all of our governmental funds, not just the general fund. And this really shows you our revenues by source. And this year we had a bit of increase in our grants and contributions, which as those increase, then some of the just mathematically some of the other numbers decrease. Our property taxes are down to 3% of our general governmental activities revenue. Again, has been the case forever. Our sales and use taxes are our primary source of revenue at 55.4% for all of our governmental activities. And then in addition, we are generating about 7% of our revenues from sales and property tax increment in our urban renewal areas. Going to the next slide, we get more into the fund financial statements. Again, the fund is used to maintain control over the resources that have been segregated for specific activities and objectives. The main difference between the fund statements and the government-wide statements is that the fund statement focus on spendable resources, and financial information based on spendable resources is useful in evaluating the city's short-term financing requirements. As far as the proprietary funds, they're actually fairly close to the government-wide statements, and they're again generally used to account for services for the city charges customers, both outside and internal. And proprietary funds provide the same information as the government-wides, only with more detail. So moving on to the next slide, looking at the utility fund specifically, our net position increased 31.7 million. Operating revenues increased 3.9 million, while operating expenses increased 0.9 million. One thing to note on there is operating revenues are partially utilized to make capital improvements as well. So moving on to the net position of the golf course, we increased the net position to 16.1 million, about $500,000 this year. The golf course paid down about 800,000 in principal and interest. They invested about $32,000 in acquisition and construction of capital assets. They were positive in their operating income of $59,000, and expenses included about $700,000 of depreciation. So when you're looking at operating income and you look at the fact that they had $700,000 of depreciation and still made $59,000, that looks pretty favorable, especially if you've been looking at this chart for the number of years that I've been looking at it. So moving on to the sales and use tax revenue, of course, this is our bread and butter for the general fund. Overall, as I mentioned earlier, increased about 4.8 million more than we had in 2018. Of that amount, the public safety tax accounted for about 17.5 million of the total 104 million that was generated. And this, just to be clear, does not include the sales tax increment from WIDA or the post sales and use tax. This is just the post is parks, open space, and trails. This is just the general sales tax and the public safety tax. And then we look at the general fund / sales tax fund balance at one from the budgeting perspective and then from an operating perspective. All year long, we have a general fund, we have a sales tax fund, but for the CAFR, we actually have to consolidate that as required by GASB. So this is taking a look at the fund balance for both of the general fund and the sales tax fund. And in fact, on my last slide, I'm going to get down into what our fund balances are a little bit more specifically, because I think obviously with the COVID and the fact that we're going to be probably utilizing some of our reserves, I think it's very important that I go over that with you. So overall, our fund balance did decrease this year by about 2.1 million. We do have a fund balance though of 48.3 million. Included in that is 15.2 million, which is restricted and assigned. And so that includes the Tabor emergency reserve that we're required to have, which is about 5.6 million. And then as you are aware, we have a reserve fund policy. And of that, we have about 8.3 million that's assigned according to that reserve fund policy. The unassigned general fund balance is about 6.8 million. That does include the fleet fund. And then the sales tax is, wait, let me pull this slide up here. I think I might have. So the sales tax fund has about 16.2 million. And I think I just misspoke. The general fund balance, well, actually, including the fleet fund, is about 6.8 million. Then our fund balance or fund reserve that we have previously kind of considered our permafrost reserve, meaning that, for the most part, we're going to try to keep that close to 10% of what our expenditures are, or general fund, and that's about $14 million. And then we have what we call the stabilization reserve fund, and this is the reserve fund that we actually utilize if we need it. This 2020 is going to be a perfect year where we would access this, and then as things get better, then we would replenish it. So this is a reserve that we have historically utilized in that manner. And again, as I mentioned, the sales and use tax fund balance is about $16.2 million. And so I think that it's good to have those reserves. It's good to be able to look at those when in times like these. And I, for one, as your finance director, I'm extremely happy that we have them. And that actually concludes my presentation, and I'll open it up for questions.
All right, Ms. Scully, you had a question.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I have a question. My question is, where does the parks and open space tax fall into the pie chart? I didn't see it on there. Is it other or maybe sales and use or?
Okay, so the actual post sales tax in the pie chart would show up in the sales and use tax, because that chart is for all governmental activities, not just the general fund.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good job, Tammy. It's an excellent report.
Thank you.
Any other questions from any member of council on Ms. Hitchens' report? Ms. Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Tammy, thank you so much for this information, and it was a lot to soak in. My first time on council, I read it as a constituent, but having now be on this side, it's interesting to say the least. So thank you for that detailed explanation. I did have one question on the report. It's on page 4 of 229. There was BKD's audit testing included 112 payments that they considered quote unquote at risk for having not been reported the correct year. I realize that there's a lot of moving parts for these types of reporting. Is 112 high, low, average? It just seems quite high to me to have 112 at risk reports. I know that we've been working to correct that, but if you could kind of explain that to me, that would be helpful.
Well, actually, Councilor Smith, that is a great segue into BKD's report on the management, giving you the manager report, as well as talking about some of those. And I will say that I believe that when you hear the explanation of what that is, it will make a little bit more sense. It's kind of a presumption that there's 112 payment. And Marcy will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, but it's kind of a presumption based on the fact that we in accounting really only looked at anything kind of over $25,000 to make sure that it was in the right year, but based on the testing and the percentages and whatnot, that there was a presumption that there would be 112 payments that were in the wrong year. So anyway, I'll hand it over to Marcy and she can explain their report, including that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
I don't have any other questions at this time. So Marcy, if you want to come in.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Let me just first start off by answering the question so I don't forget to circle back to it. When we were looking at AP cutoff and making sure expenditures are reported in the right period, management places internal controls of what they think would be adequate to capture so that you don't have a material misstatement in the financial statements. And the volume of expenditures that happen are quite high. And there's a cutoff period, and most entities set a threshold, as management has, of what they're looking at. And I didn't count the number of transactions of the 112, but when we were looking through, we were saying, could we see everything? And we got down to, we actually use electronic auditing and we match it. Every expenditure that has gone out the door subsequent to year end, we match that to the AP ledger using electronic auditing techniques. And so that was the stuff where we couldn't match it. Now, that's not saying that it wasn't recorded, but this is our estimate of potentially items that were missed. And honestly, at 372,000, it is, I would say, a pretty minimal finding, or a minimal amount, because we have what we call considered past adjustments or waived entries that aren't recorded. And when you looked at the impact of these, they were very immaterial to the funds. So I would say management's process is working. Does that answer your question adequately?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. So for my part of the presentation, I am just going to work off the attachments you have. And I do want to echo Tammy's first remarks. An audit 100% remote is a very challenging thing. And I just wanted to thank Tammy and her team. They were very responsive. We had a lot of meetings. They were, they went above and beyond and got us everything we needed. So I really wanted to thank them for all their cooperation and helping us get the audit. And actually, I think the fantastic thing to note is that we met all of our original deadlines. So considering we did it in those circumstances, it was a very large feat for all of us to undertake. On page 195 or 194 of 229, this is, I just want to point out this as part of the financial statements. This is what we call the schedule of findings and question costs. And this is essentially a one-stop shop for the results of the audit. This is filed as part of the single audit, but I think it's a great summary. So just going through this real quickly, we did issue an unmodified opinion, which is a clean or the best opinion you can get. We had no internal control over financial reporting findings that were either considered a material weakness or a significant deficiency. On the single audit, so that's the audit of the federal funds, anytime you receive over $750,000 in federal awards, a single audit has to be performed. We did not have any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal control over compliance. We issued an unmodified report on the single audit, and we had no findings that were required to be disclosed. So as part of the single audit, there's a risk assessment we go through, and the major program that was selected this year was the high intensity drug trafficking areas. And on that next page, you'll see that we had no financial statement or single audit findings that were required to be reported as part of the single audit report. So a very clean report gets uploaded to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse for all those oversight entities to review. Does anybody have any questions on just the audit in general before I move on to our letter? Okay, I didn't see any in the chat.
There's not any right now, Marcy, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna move on to our audit letter that's on page 204 of 229. And this is our standard communication letter of items that we are required to report to you all by auditing standards. And for certain items, you'll note there's nothing to report. It will say no matters reportable. So I'm just gonna go through and hit the highlights on the letter. The first page just talks about the auditing standards that we followed. Page 2 of our letter on the significant accounting policies, you can find those in footnote 1 of the financial statements. Now, every financial statement, management has to make certain estimates in preparing the financial information. And there's a range of estimates in your CAFR. And those are listed here on the bottom of page 2. So as we are going through the audit, we definitely look at estimates, we look at the underlying information, we test the values, we look at the reasonableness of those estimates. And there is nothing unusual related to any of these estimates. So on page 3, there are certain financial statement disclosures just to point out to you. One is the revenue recognition that is followed. There's the various pieces in the different types of funds. The implementation of new accounting standards. There were 3 standards adopted by management this year. And then just to point out the subsequent events, there were quite a few subsequent events in this year's CAFR, and one of the ones just to point out is the disclosures relating to COVID-19. And this is just best practice right now to let your investors and citizens and everyone know that we just don't know the effects of what this is going to do to the financial statements. in the middle of page 3, during the course of the audit, we may propose adjustments. We had 2 adjustments that we proposed that were recorded by management. One was an entry to adjust the stop loss receivable balance. It was just overstated when it was recorded. The other was to fix a conversion amount for the revenues earned, but that were not available. So it's that reconciliation between the fund financial statements and government-wide. There was just an entry required between those. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are several entries as we find stuff throughout the audit where we assess whether they would have a material misstatement. And if it's determined they don't have a material misstatement and management chooses not to record them, we call those proposed audit adjustments or past entries. So we had a couple of those this year. None of them were determined to be material, so we agree with management not posting them. One related to the stop loss receivable, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the letter. One related to the AP items we discussed. There was a school land dedication fee in the implementation of GASB 84. That fee has always been treated like it's not your own revenue when it should be. And the implementation of 84 highlighted that issue as a lot of stuff had to be analyzed with that implementation for fiduciary activities. So going forward, I believe that school land dedication fee will be recorded. There was an EDA accrual that was not recorded. And then in the analysis for GASB 84, which is fiduciary activities, it's a very complex analysis to figure out what's included and what's not. One of the items that should be reported as a fiduciary fund is the volunteer firefighter plan that FPPA holds. But it was determined by management, and we agree, it's not a material plan. And so that it was not necessary to record in the financial statement. So we posed a past adjustment entry this year because it's the year of implementation, but this will not be a carry forward item you see. It's just something to know that it's out there, but it's not disclosed. And one of the reasons is it's a closed plan, and you know, we're just need time for it to close out, and then everything will come back to the city if anything is left. On page 4, GASB 84 was adopted, and what you'll see there are new fiduciary funds in the financial statements, which Tammy discussed. There's also added footnote disclosures to the investment footnote 2A. And then the adoption of GASB statement number 88 really just added additional information to your debt disclosures. And you can see that in footnote 2H. We did not have any disagreements with management. During the audit process, we did have significant discussions on both the implementation of GASB 84 and 88. We've also been discussing the IBNR estimation process with management. On the page 5 of our letter, we had no difficulties encountered in performing the audit other than it being 100% remote. But other than that, there were no problems at all. And you'll see attached to this communication is the management representation of representations management made to us for the audit piece. Are there any questions? Can I pause there and ask any questions on any of this information before I go into the internal control discussion?
You have any questions or comments from council based on the stuff that Ms. Arden has just given us? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next section. Ms. Arden, I'm seeing no movement from council. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So when we are talking about internal control over financial reporting, there's 3 levels of potential control deficiencies. The most significant is considered a material weakness. And what that means is if there's a material weakness, there would be a likelihood of material misstatement in the financial statements, and controls are not working properly. Significant deficiencies are less material, but they still warrant your attention to know that there may be some controls not working as well as they should be. And then we have control deficiencies, and that's just, there's a reasonable possibility that something could go uncorrected, but in most instances for just control deficiencies, there are other compensating controls in place that would maybe catch some of those. So we did have one deficiency, and that really related to the recording of the stop loss receivable and our proposed audit adjustment. That entry, just a wrong number was grabbed from the report. So it was overstated by, I think, a little over $1 million. So we needed that to be made because that was a large adjustment. So our recommendation here is just making sure we're understanding the information provided by the third party and what needs to be recorded as part of the year-end close processes. Moving into the other matters, there are some significant, and Tammy nailed it, GASB's been very active over the last several years, and they're still very active. There are several future pronouncements coming online. And some of these are going to be significant and take a lot of time. One in particular is the first one you see, that's GASB 87 on leases. I think one of the toughest things here is making sure we can identify or have a complete population of all the leases that the city has. There's also some, in talking with management, there's some leases out there that have some unique terms and agreements, and how do you apply the standards to those? So this is something where early preparation is going to be key. There's another one on conduit debt obligations that's coming out, but most notably, I want to point you to statement number 95. Now, this was issued on May 7th, so it was a little late for our audit, but with COVID-19, GASB's response was to give an 18-month postponement for statement 87, and then all other statements had a 1-year postponement. So you can see as they're coming out that they have given some relief so that governments can focus on what really matters right now. That was everything I had. Are there any other questions I can address?
Ms. Hitchens, you want to wrap up on your portion of it then, along with Ms. Arden?
Yeah, so I guess, again, I'd like to thank BKD as well as our staff, and in particular, I would like to recognize Sherry Sanchez for leading the group of employees that we have. We had accountants, a financial administrator, Karen Kreger, accountants Gary Newcomb, Lonnie Williams, and I know I'm going to miss somebody here. We had Lori Nusser and Cricket Martin. And then we had folks in our sales tax division that helped, particularly James McDonald. We had treasury folks, Sherry Young and Chad Smith, as well as Bob Beyerhoff. This audit, Kim McDaniel had a tremendous load to carry this year with the inclusion of GASB 84 and the pension. And so, I guess my point being is it really kind of takes a village to get this thing done. And especially under the difficult circumstances that we had, I would like to, make sure that I give the thanks to the staff for doing it. There's another one in the books, and we're going to be sending this one in to GFOA. We did, for the Certificate of Achievement program, we did receive, for our 2018 CAFR, we did receive the award. You'll be seeing that in next week's agenda memo where we're going to have the official acceptance of this CAFR. And anyway, many thanks to the entire staff for getting this done.
All right, thanks, Tammy. I know this is an ongoing, and Marcy, thank you to your team for working so hard to accommodate the fact that everything's being done remote. But Tammy, to you, Larry, to the rest of the team, you know, we're looking at year number 37 coming up to get this award for excellence in financial reporting, and we couldn't be asking for a better team. Under a lot of circumstances, a lot of issues of trying to work out and coordinate stuff differently than we've ever had to before. And the fact you still got it done, we got everything done on time. We got an excellent report again. Thanks to all of you.
Mayor, may I?
For all the work you did on behalf of myself and council, and I have.
Mayor, may I interrupt?
I have one other.
I did find my list. We have ERP business analyst Vicki Adams, as well as Don Cartier, who's an accountant, who also, and then Maggie Hunter, who is our finance department's executive assistant, who is very involved in all of this as well.
Okay. Well, if there's anybody's name that got missed, you can all call Tammy tomorrow and tell her.
That's right. That's why I'm trying to get them all out there.
Ms. Seitz, you had a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and you said it well. Tammy, your team is consistently impressive, not only just your mastery at reporting what's gone on over the year, but you do it when the playing field changes every single year. So, and this year you had the added fun of you know, COVID-19 in addition to GASB 84 and 88. So thank you. And Marcy, I think I have seen you report on the audit 6 times now, and I do appreciate your diligence in looking it over. And I am also very proud of the fact that we have done so well every single year. I did want to real quickly highlight for my colleagues, I do think that GASB 87 is interesting to us. I do know that we have in the past and currently lease a lot of city-owned businesses. And I think this might help us evaluate that and make sure that we're getting the maximum public benefit for those leases. So thanks so much, everyone.
Anyone else on council have any comments they'd like to make in regards to this item? All right, seeing none. Mr. Dorr, or you, Mr. Tripp, any other comments on this item?
No, sir. Thanks to you, Mr. Mayor and Council, for all of your attention, comments, and feedback and questions. And thanks to Tammy and Marcy. Thank you all.
All right, if there's nothing else on this item, Mr. Tripp, let's move to item 2. And before we start, let me recognize, please, if you would, Mr. Lindsay, who's in here on his vacation, helping bring this information to us. So Chris, thank you for coming in on your vacation time. All right, Mr. Tripp.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'm going to ask real quick if you can see the community survey slide that's up.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Mayor and Council. It's really good to be speaking with you tonight in regards to the community survey, and thank you for the shout out there. I'd like to first off recognize the folks that worked on this really critical project. Thank you, big thank you to Teresa Boko, our staff project manager for the survey in the policy and budget department. And thank you to Lori Urban and Michelle Kobayashi in the National Research Center. Lori has been NRC's project manager for this survey, and I'm also going to introduce Michelle here momentarily. There's a lot of information in the attachments to tonight's staff report. There are well over 100 pages in the main survey itself. We've tried to distill down into a few key findings for tonight's presentation, but we cannot present on all of the questions that were asked. There's so much in the document itself, including the regional and national benchmarks that tell much of the story. There's an incredible amount of data in the appendices, and I would highlight the verbatim responses to the open-ended question beginning on page 55. I would also highlight the comparison of select questions by demographics starting on page 65. There's really a lot of interesting information back there. As I mentioned, there's a lot of information and we'll have a good chunk of it tonight in the presentation. Please provide us feedback on where you would like to see more feedback. And lastly, I would like to indicate staff will be posting both the survey and the presentation to the city's website. So to start things off, I'd like to introduce Michelle Kobayashi, the Vice President of the National Research Center. She'll provide some background information on herself and a little bit more about her many years of service with the city.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here tonight. I want to start by saying I actually started my career 30 years ago at the city of Boulder, where I actually was a research analyst and did resident surveys for them. And the city of Westminster actually called my boss and myself and asked us if we could do a survey for them. And so we started working on your community survey in 1992, did your first survey. Then we formed National Research Center so we could start doing all the work we were doing for Boulder nationally, and just started doing lots of research and survey projects. But you've always been our first client and been a very loyal client in terms of doing your survey over and over and being really strong in the area of performance measurement and caring very much about bringing residents into government decision making. So this relationship has been very strong. We have now done 15 surveys for you. I also want to say I've lived in Westminster in my early 20s, and I also worked at the Westminster Mall when I was in high school and used to cruise it in the 80s like many other high school students. So have a lot of experience with Westminster. But as I said, the survey we did this year in January, 3 weeks in January, starting January 10th, a mailed survey. This was the 15th administration. So you guys do it about every other year. We mailed the survey to 4,000 households. First, they get a postcard invitation, then a full survey 2 times 1 week later. We offered it also online for folks who'd prefer to get online to complete the survey and in Spanish. Of the 4,000 we sent out, we got about 613 back, which is a response rate of 16%. That is a drop by 4 or 5% from 2018. And we've seen response rates steadily decreasing across the nation. We saw your response rate decrease more in 2018 than this year. With 613 completed surveys, we have a margin of error plus or minus 4%. As we done every other year, we weighted your data to reflect your community based on the census data. So we weighted by gender, age, race, ethnicity, household type, whether it's attached or detached, the tenure, renter versus owner, and then also school district. So we wanted to make sure we got a better or more representative picture of residents across the community of Westminster. As Chris said, we have some appendices where we look at the demographics and by school district, and those can be very interesting when you want to dig deeper into the survey responses. And we also have a national benchmark database that we compare responses as we can to. And we also, for you, compare to front range norms and comparisons when we have data available. Next slide, please. So this year, we actually decided, and actually we did it last time too, we decided to break the survey by your strategic plan goals. In this way, the data are broken in ways that the council and staff can use it to make sure we're supporting the goals that are interesting and also provide information on how well you might be doing when we use the survey in terms of performance evaluation or what types of new policies or planning needs to happen. So when you get to the report, you will actually see the data broken by these different chapters. But we do have an appendix that has all the data, just the survey all as one. And in the presentation today, we're going to talk just about the key highlights, as Chris said, since we only have 20 minutes. Next slide, please. So the key finding, number one, we'll start, is that Westminster residents gave positive marks to the quality of life in the city and the quality of their neighborhoods. Next slide. And so what we found when we asked folks to rate their quality of their life and the quality of their neighborhoods, we found about 8 in 10 residents gave the response of excellent or good. We found the quality of neighborhood ratings that was consistent from 2018. The overall quality of life in Westminster decreased from the 2018 administration. In terms of front range and national benchmarks, the overall quality of life is below those. Quality of neighborhood is similar. We also, and you'll see more in the end of the presentation, we actually asked about the vision statements you have. And we asked people how much they agreed with different statements that you have in your visions as your vision statements. And what we found when we asked people Westminster should be a city that has a community with distinct neighborhoods. We found about 68% of residents agreed with that statement. Next slide. We also asked about a number of aspects of community that determine whether people, how they judge a community in terms of its quality or place to live. And so we asked them what it was like to be a place to live, as a place to raise kids, place to retire. What are the schools like? What's the image and reputation? All these kinds of questions about the quality of Westminster. And what we find is like 8 in 10 residents give high ratings to the city as a place to live and raise kids. And that's actually much higher, like place to raise kids sometimes is more difficult to attain. Image and reputation, about 7 in 10 said Westminster had an excellent or good one. About half of your residents, still a majority, said Westminster was an excellent or good place to retire and rated the quality of public schools excellent or good. And that varies by school district. What we found is there was not very much change from 2018 to 2020, except in the area of image and reputation. In that area, we actually saw a decline from 2018, but your rating is still on par with the nation and Front Range. Next slide. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to Chris now. Yes.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to jump in here and highlight a couple of the next couple of key findings. So key finding number 2, perceptions of safety and the quality of safety services declined from 2018 to 2020. About 3/4 of respondents felt very or somewhat safe from residential fires in Westminster. About 7 in 10 reported feeling safe from violent crimes, and about half felt safe from property crimes. Perceptions of safety declined from 2018 to 2020, and ratings of safety from violent and property crimes were lower than both benchmark groups. Residents rated their level of agreement with various statements that describe the image of the city of Westminster. About 3/4 of respondents agreed that safe and secure described Westminster's image. However, fewer agreed that the statement captured the image of the city in 2020 as compared to 2018. Life and safety related city services were viewed as some of the most important. At least 88% of residents felt fire and police protection, EMS, drinking water quality, and emergency preparedness were essential or very important services. Quality evaluations of these services ranged from 61% very good or good for emergency preparedness to 89% for fire protection. Evaluations of fire protection, EMS, and emergency preparedness decreased from 2018 to 2020, while ratings for others remained stable. When comparing service ratings of quality and importance, emergency preparedness was deemed of lower quality and higher importance, indicating an area that might warrant further investigation and potentially further investment. I think myself and probably members of the team were curious to see if perceptions around emergency preparedness and the quality and importance have changed in the last 3 months. So I think the change in perceptions related to public safety really stuck out for the team, and we've dug in quite a bit on the public safety questions. We've talked to numerous folks around the city, including the chief of both groups and others about the declines in ratings of public safety. We've also looked at a large amount of data on calls and others, and we believe that there's a number of reasons why resident perceptions have declined. And we've put many of them on the screen here. I think some of these ratings may reflect what is true or accurate in the city, but some may be related to more perception for items involving national trends and media attention. To that end, and actually well before this survey went out, the police department was engaged with the National Research Center in participating in the National Police Services Survey. The National Police Services Study, or the NPSS, will help us understand resident fears, relationships with the police, and public safety priorities. We hope to see results actually here shortly, the next couple of months. From a list of 15 broad service categories and potential goals for the city, those related to life and safety topped the list. Providing safe drinking water and sewer services and providing for a safe community were first and third respectively in the list as essential or very important services for the city to do. Key finding number 3, survey respondents continued to value and place a high importance on parks and recreation services. And I think we continue to note that this is a hallmark of the city and the services we provide. Recreation programs, recreation facilities, trails, and parks maintenance were among the services of highest quality. Ratings of each of these services has been relatively stable since 2008. The quality of recreation facilities and recreation programs was rated higher than the national benchmarks, but similar to the Front Range, while the ratings for trails was lower than both the averages. Parks maintenance was rated similar to the nation, but lower than the Front Range comparison. While the quality of parks and recreation services was high, their level of importance varied from 84% with parks maintenance to 69% for recreation programs, saying they're essential or very important. Importance evaluations for these services in 2020 was on par with 2018, but the importance of trails has continued to climb since 2008. About 9 in 10 residents, or 93%, felt that beautiful parks and open spaces described the image of the city of Westminster. This has topped the list of 8 statements since 2012. For the first time in 2020, and at council's urging, respondents were able to write in their own words the single most important thing the city could do to improve the quality of life for its community members. Of the 70% of respondents providing a comment, 10% noted actions related to open space, trails, and parks as the most important for the city to take to improve the quality of life. Additionally, when assessing different concepts that should be included in the city's vision statement, 88% agreed that a community that embraces the outdoors should be included. And I mentioned trails on a previous slide. Survey respondents assessed a number of potential problems in the city. The unavailability of trails or trail connections was a major or moderate problem for 16% of respondents in 2020. And while minor, that level of concern almost doubled since 2018. While taking a little bit deeper look into this, we noted that one of the city's existing trails was under major reconstruction prior to 2020. The Big Dry Creek Trail was being paved to allow for higher volumes of use. It may be that the congestion due to construction impacted these results, and we look forward to seeing how this trend continues in the future. Lastly, on this key finding, from the list of 15 broad service categories and potential goals, about 8 in 10 respondents said it was essential or very important for the city of Westminster to provide access to parks and recreational opportunities, which was similar to 2018. That goal was 4th out of 15. Key finding number 4, residents voiced concerns about affordable housing and density in Westminster. Westminster is joining the ranks of other Front Range cities where residents have desires around housing and growth that are becoming more and more difficult to reconcile. I think you'll see more on the following slides, but we wanted to offer a little bit more on this. We called this a paradox because the lack of affordable housing and the concerns about residential density are related. One major factor in achieving affordable housing is residential density. And our community has shown its very divided opinions around this issue. So let's dig deeper on the next couple of slides here. The single action most frequently mentioned by respondents that could improve the quality of life for the community was affordable housing. Again, that was on the open-ended question that was added to the survey. So 1 in 5 residents indicated an item related to affordable housing and as a way the city could improve the community's quality of life. However, when prioritizing the list of 15 goals or services the city provides, ensuring the city provides ample affordable or workforce housing was rated among the bottom 4, with 65% saying that this was essential or very important for the city to take. The high cost of housing was a major or moderate problem for 7 in 10 respondents, and too much growth was a concern for about 6 in 10. Both of these potential problems were of similar concern for residents in 2018 and 2020. However, concerns about both have been on the rise since 2010. The survey dug deeper into specific types of growth, and we wanted to highlight those. About 6 in 10 respondents felt that commercial and retail growth in Westminster had a very or somewhat positive impact on the overall quality of life. Resident opinion on residential growth was roughly split. Fewer felt positively about the impacts of density. Almost 3 times as many residents said the impacts of density on the quality of life in the city was negative compared to those that felt it was positive. And about half of the respondents felt that the city's vision statement should include the next urban center of the Colorado Front Range. And about 1 in 5 strongly disagreed that this concept should be included. And we'll touch on that a bit more towards the end. Because residential growth stuck out quite a bit, we took a deeper dive on this question. The city has been pushing to develop in specific focus areas around town. And we're seeing urban style development and increased density in those areas. 3 of the 4 most recent multifamily projects occurred in focus areas, and the 4th was supported based on the city's policy to support affordable housing. Lastly, when we talk about growth, want to talk about mobility. About 1/3 of respondents said that traffic flow on major streets was very good or good. 1/4 felt it was neither good nor bad, and roughly 1/3 said it was bad or very bad. This rating was lower than both the national and the Front Range benchmarks. The ratings of snow removal have continued to decrease since 2014. The quality of street repair was similar to 2018, but reached an all-time low in 2020. Quality ratings for street repair, however, were similar compared to the national and Front Range benchmarks, while the ratings of street cleaning and snow removal were lower than both the comparisons. And among 15 goals or services, again, that the city provides, ensuring streets are well maintained and clear of snow was viewed as the 2nd most important item, up from the 3rd most important item in 2018. And I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to discuss the vision statement.
Thank you, Chris. So this year we decided to put on the elements that you're going to or thinking about including in your vision statement. And we asked the residents how much they agreed, whether this should be included in the city's vision statement. And you can see them all here. This is the percentage of people who agree that this should be included as part of what makes Westminster. And so you'll see some of those trends Chris talked about the community that embraces the outdoors. Folks want to see Westminster being an inclusive city and has good education and is well connected. Resilient economy, a sustainable city. Those are all by 3/4 or more of residents agree with that statement. A creative city also. The 2 statements that get a little less support, a community with distinct neighborhoods, you get about almost 7 in 10 though, still supporting that into the vision statement. But the next urban center of Colorado's Front Range, that is the one statement that really has more of the mixed in reviews. Chris talked more about the residents' thoughts on density and growth. And you'll see the split there of seeing how some folks really embrace that idea and others do not. Next slide. And so that kind of sums up what we're going to talk about in terms of the survey data. Again, we have so much more in these reports, but I want to talk a little bit more about your next steps and what communities often do once they finish a survey like this. So we find that people do a lot of things with their resident survey results. You guys have been monitoring trends in resident opinion, been one of the first local governments to do that and do it over time. And so you're experts kind of at that, at watching those trends and seeing when something is significant or not and when to make a reaction. We want to continue to measure government performance. You, interestingly, and I think fortunately, did your survey right before COVID hit. We have other communities now doing their surveys now with COVID, and it's really hard to disentangle what's happening due to COVID versus what was happening before. So you kind of have a baseline pre-COVID. So when you do your survey again in 2022, it'll be interesting to see how those changes manifest and what is happening with the programs and the policies you put forward. They see a lot of people use their resident surveys to inform budget, land use, strategic planning decisions. we didn't talk about it in the slideshow, but I really like the performance importance matrix we have later in the report, where because we've asked your residents which services are most important and which ones have the highest quality. And sometimes that can be really useful information if you get to the point that you have to start cutting some services or refocusing energies and resources. That page in the survey report can really kind of give you some data to back any decisions you have about how you have to make some changes to the way you budget and perform over the next recovery period for COVID. And again, we have these benchmark service ratings. It's always good to compare, but really we believe the best comparison is you to yourself over time. And you guys have a great trend line. Next slide, please. And so how do you take action? What can you do more with these survey results? First one, and it sounds like Chris said you're already going to put it on your website, but it's really important to keep residents engaging with you and to keep that rating up. You have a pretty high rating in terms of welcoming residents into government decision making. In fact, you have quite a high rating. And it's really important for residents to know how you're using their voice in decisions. So sharing their information back makes you transparent and accountable, but also talking about how you're using it. That's really the important key to the next step of people feeling heard. You have strategic plan meetings coming up soon, maybe taking some of this data and trying to incorporate that into the strategic plan. You can do follow-up focus groups or dig deeper. The other thing that you are all doing is you also are now, we have a company we merged with Polco last year, which is a civic engagement platform. And you are able to now use that panel. You're doing surveys on it, but you also can use it if you want to dig deeper on any of these issues and ask residents policy issues or ask them more about their perceptions or what's going on with trails or growth or anything you're interested in. Or you can also look at things such as COVID. We see a lot of communities now doing a lot of surveys about COVID and asking the business community and the residents to talk about reopening and things such as that. So you have the ability now to kind of dig deeper into the survey data with this online engagement platform. And like Chris talked about earlier, you have your National Police Survey data coming out soon. And so we're going to dig a lot deeper into your opinions, resident opinions on what's happening in your community. And I do want to say it's really awesome you guys did that at the timing you did, because you were actually in the field before the George Floyd case happened and all the events have occurred across the nation and in our communities. So the fact that you've been ahead of this police resident community relationship issue, I think is really important. And I look forward to you guys listening to all that information and finding out and working forward with your citizen groups on that. Next slide. Questions?
All right, Chris and Michelle, we have a question from Mr. Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It was more of a comment. I appreciate the presentation very much, but I found it interesting because it's topical tonight in that 95% of our residents found law enforcement either essential, which was 80% of that, or very important, and then police protection important at 96%. So I think that validates what we talked about and what City Manager Tripp talked about is what our residents see is the importance that law enforcement plays in our community and keeping them safe. And then also my other comment too was looking at, I extensively read the comments on both the mailed survey and also the online survey. If you put those side by side, there's a great deal of similarities in those. And when we look at the comparison on our vision statement as Westminster as the next urban center, 60% of those on the online either disagreed or strongly disagreed. So I understand statistical validation extremely well, but we also have to look at when those comments are side by side, how they match up very well with what they were put on the mailed out survey. So I appreciate that opportunity to put that on the table.
Mr. DeMott had a comment.
Thank you, Mayor. Some of the same things that I noticed in it that were interesting and probably not super surprising to any of us that have went through these before. Some of the downward trends I think were a little surprising, but I think that it's timely though, in the fact that I'm glad that we're trying to move forward with our strategic planning, because I think it gives us some good discussion points between the low rating on the urban center piece. And when you match that up, I think it was interesting when you match it up with outdoors pieces, we kind of that's always the gem of Westminster is we have so much open space. So I think it'll bring some good discussion points for us between the desire for safety as well as, really what our vision for the city is that matches up with our citizens.
Ms. Seitz?
Thank you. I don't know why my computer is taking so long to turn on the video. I had a question just about our response rate, that it went down 5 percentage points. I believe it was 16% of that 4,000 responded. And that this has been a trend where it's been going down. And I think you said 2018, it went down even more significantly. Are we thinking into the future? Do we feel this might be a dinosaur, this form? And if so, do you contemplate seeing us do a hybrid in the future or something so that we can still have benchmarks, right, that we're monitoring, that we don't lose kind of the value of the citizen survey, but we're recognizing a self-selecting group that's going through a very long paper survey. And I know it's not self-selecting, you send it out, but those who choose to respond, that might be getting more and more difficult. So that's my first question, and I'll wait for a response before I ask my next.
Thanks, Anita. That's a great question. One of the reasons actually we merged with Polko, which is the digital engagement platform, is because we do believe the future of surveying is moving away from paper and pencil. We still use these probability-based methods because we don't have inclusive lists of everyone's email addresses. So if we want to make sure we're being representative, we still like this mail out, mail back solution. And we also like the fact that we are now putting in these non-probability methods, these ways where we are reaching folks in different ways besides the postcards to their house and mailed surveys. So we're trying to embrace that new technology. And in some communities, we have found when we look at the probability and non-probability surveys, they look so much alike that we blend them. And so that could be something in the future. The Westminster, the more we look at your data and the more we can get those outreach and those populations to look similar, we may decide to blend that data. The other thing that we're thinking about a lot at National Research Center is possibly doing more with these panels and actually doing shorter surveys with more frequency. You, as part of your policing survey, I don't know if you all know this, but you're actually building a panel, and you actually are building a panel from your probability, non-probability survey that was just the online option that was not the probability sample. We're collecting folks onto your Polko site that actually agree to kind of sign up and be part of a panel, and then over time they will interact with you. It's our goal, if we can get enough people on that panel and get a representative group of folks on that panel, that we can start doing not just annual surveys, but doing monthly surveys or weekly surveys and doing them on shorter, more pulse types of things. That's kind of the goal. We're not quite there, so we're kind of in that hybrid stage. But we have a lot of hope that this panel building and getting people to kind of participate and cooperate with us over time, it gives us this connection to folks, because the hard part is getting people online or to answer the survey. Once they're doing it, it's fine. It's just getting them engaged to begin with and understanding the importance of it. But I also see really the future of it in terms of folks realizing, like, having other groups, so you can work with your nonprofits or groups that reach diverse populations, having those folks kind of give some authenticity to the work you're doing, and they're reaching out to the folks they trust and getting people in to talk to you. But that then has a responsibility for you all to then, once you use their data and collect it, show them how and let them understand how important their contribution is and how this active civic engagement, which is maybe takes 5 minutes a month or 10 minutes a month, how crucial it is to your organization. So that's our vision at NRC Polko. And we think, you're started, and I don't know how many people you have on your non-probability or your panel you're building for Polko yet, but we're asking folks, to sign up and be part of that. And I think into the future, when we do 2022 or even some work in between, we might utilize that panel more, and we'll be doing more of this probability, non-probability hybrid mixing to make sure your sample sizes are big. And also we have enough people in the different demographic subgroups to make representative claims about their opinions and priorities. Does that make sense?
It does. If I'm hearing you correctly, so something you said actually sparks a little bit of concern for me. So the panels for the police survey are being created out of folks who self-selected to fill out a survey on our website?
No, that's not all of it. That's just like we did with the NCS or your resident survey. There's the non-probability sample, and that closes tomorrow. Those people have been randomly selected. It is about to go online for folks who want to respond, and those are going to be kept separate. But you will have the responses for the probability sample that was our traditional way to reach out. You're also going to get responses from your opt-in, and those are going to be a very interesting comparison to see who comes to the website on their own versus who we struck out and talked to. So we're doing it both ways. But again, you can use them together to make some decisions, or you can just use the probability sample. It'll be interesting nonetheless to look at how that works. We also, you started your data collection prior to the Floyd George event. So we also can date the survey data before and after to see, even with our probability sample, if things change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that seems like that would be incredibly relevant. So with that said, recognizing that there probably are some pretty big changes that aren't in the future, they're actually occurring even now. I think it would be helpful for our staff to really be mindful and maybe collaborate with you to understand what data we should be capturing every time we interface with our public. So we're getting that robust database of email addresses for community members. Appreciate that you guys are already on top of that. This is a very specific question. I was really surprised that emergency preparedness scored so low. Reason being, I'm really proud of the work Westminster had done on that in between 2018 and 2019. And I think this might indicate this is an area that we can communicate better on. Sometimes I don't know if we do great work, and I don't always know that we're letting the residents, the taxpayers, know what we're doing with those dollars. So I feel like that was just kind of a reminder to do a better job telling our story. I want to agree with Councilor Demont. I was not surprised at all to see that our open space program, our trails, our parks, our recreation were so valued by our community members. And I can only imagine after COVID-19, the desire and the value of those open spaces are really felt even more keenly by our residents. I know they have been my lifeboat and my family's lifeboat through all of this. So I do agree. I think we should use this data to look at our our strategic planning process, and really, I think maybe make sure have a good geographic distribution and access to those amenities throughout our city, and maybe enhance them. And then finally, I was disappointed, and I'm aware and watching kind of that some of the downward trends that we saw. I do want to say, based off of those, a big thank you to my colleague, Councilor Voles, and to staff Cody, Blue Herb, and others who really have worked on enhancing our neighborhood outreach and communication and leadership programs. I think if our citizen surveys told us anything, it's that's really essential. We need to be out letting people know we value their opinions, listening, learning, and acting. So I do find a lot of really actionable information here, and I appreciate the effort. Thank you.
Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for this information. It's so helpful and so timely in a variety of ways, especially with our strategic planning coming up in July. I think that there's a lot of benchmarks in itself that we can lend to helping guide us in making those critical decisions for our city. So I really appreciate how we have added the qualitative portion of this survey because it really lended some insights that weren't asked in a quantitative portion of the survey. And I really appreciated just reading through all of the comments, good, bad, and different, on where people stood. And it just kind of lended an opportunity for an extra voice for our residents. And with much to our finding with people want affordable housing, but at a much slower rate of growth and potentially less dense. I also found that with our drinking water, that a lot of our residents saw it to be high quality and of high importance for safe quality drinking water. But there was a slew of comments, qualitative comments about how our rates are too high. So it just kind of lends to that extra added knowledge as far as where we're at on that. So thank you for adding the qualitative portion. And then my hope for moving forward with staff is to look at our kind of what Mayor Pro Tem Seitz has said, is to look at our emergency preparedness and do a post follow-up with businesses and our community as far as how we've responded during COVID. I know that we're still kind of in that phase, but I'd like to see where we could be making those positive changes for increasing the satisfactoriness of our residents. So those are the two things that I wanted to note, but thank you for this information. It's very helpful.
I actually have a comment I'd like to make just about local government trust, just because I've been studying it the last months across the country. I wanted to let you know that local government trust is at an all-time high. Residents are really, and I don't know if it's because they're comparing it to the feds and the state, but right now the ratings that we're seeing on our surveys are showing that people are really putting their faith in local governments to be doing a good job. So it's really a good time to shine and you know, make some decisions that actually really are in tune with resident priorities, because they're looking to local governments right now.
Mr. Voles.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for this report. I appreciate it immensely. How do we, I guess I have a comment. I really do believe we have a few areas for sure at a minimum that we need to kind of dig down and get a little more information. So if that's creating focus groups, or I guess I want to know how that process works. You know, growth and density, for instance, is one for me that I would like to know more about, kind of the nuances there. You know, we kind of throw those terms around, and what do people really think about that? How do we choose where we drill down? I mean, resources aren't unlimited, so we would have to, I'm sure, pick and choose. How do we, what process will we as a council or as a city use to figure out where we want to get more information? Thank you.
Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Voles. I think we're looking to the engagement with you this evening to identify these areas. Beyond that, I think the key focus areas, or the key findings, excuse me, that were in the presentation tonight, I think are the other areas that staff would like to dig deeper into.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much. I think you did. I think in your findings you did hit on some really some areas that I also would like to see more information and kind of drill down and get a little more nuance, a little more layer to what people are thinking about. So thank you for that.
Ms. Scully.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I really appreciate this report. It was, and I appreciate this PowerPoint, going through it and really clarifying as much as you could, because I found some of the report a little challenging to understand, because it seemed to contradict itself in certain places, especially like with a need for affordable housing, but not wanting more density. That was a confusing statement to me. And also people being worried about their safety in our city, but being pleased with our police force. And so I would like to understand more of that, because I did find it a little confusing to understand. So I appreciate that we're going to drill down a little farther. I would like to have this particular slide presentation available at our strategic planning, and maybe do a quick review of it during our strategic planning, to bring it back to the forefront of our minds, so that when we are getting ready to put together our strategic plan in July, we have it right there and we can kind of look at it. I want to make sure that the residents' voices are heard and implement it into the strategic plan. So I want to make sure we have this information close at hand. I think it's said very succinctly in this presentation, and I very much appreciate that. Was very pleased to see that we have already worked on some issues that are national concerns that we've already been ahead of with our inclusivity and our work in that area. And glad to realize that it's being noticed and appreciate that very much. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Mr. DeMott.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm curious for this, I think this is for Mr. Lindsay. So when we talked about trying to drive up engagement when we were crafting this year's citizen survey, we talked about some different techniques that we could potentially use. And could you correct me or tell me if part of the thing that we talked about maybe doing, I seem to recall talking about doing like phone call outs, much like the Nielsen's of the world and those big data collecting companies do. Was there cost as a concern for those things as well? Or because I remember we had a pretty in-depth conversation about trying to do some different things in order to drive up responses. And so I'm curious now that we've seen another year where it declines, if we could, I know that we've addressed kind of how this might change in the future as these continue to decline for everybody, but we did talk about some alternative methods. So I'm just curious how we could bring some of that back and look at why we kind of drifted away from some of those ideas when we talked about them during the crafting of this cycle.
So thank you, Councillor DeMott, for that question. I think we did discuss that, and at the suggestion, I believe it was of council, we increased the number of physical survey, the mailed surveys that were sent out, and that got us to a response rate that kept that margin of error at plus or minus 4%. So I think that hit the end goal that we were looking at, of making sure we had a statistically valid survey right there around that plus or minus 4%, and we did achieve that. I don't think we're throwing out any options for the future yet. I think we're open to any and all options for the future, and how we continue to engage and get responses back.
Yeah, and I think that's actually an interesting point you bring up, that that we did increase it, because it sounds like if we hadn't increased it, we might not have ended up with the right kind of survey so that it was accurate or statistically valid. So obviously, I guess we want to avoid that in the future, to spend time and effort and tax dollars on it and not have it come back in a way that we could use it to validate what we're doing. So I'm glad that we'll continue to look at it, but I just wanted to bring it up because I'm thinking about it as you guys were talking through it, and I remember having a pretty robust discussion around how we drive that up and are there alternative methods. So maybe that could be something we try to bring back a couple months earlier than we did last time, to see if maybe we could figure out how to do it different this next year.
Other comments by council? Mr. Voles, between you and Michelle, I appreciate the information you provided us, but I think to Michelle's point, the challenge is getting people to participate. And there's so much of this online surveys, mail surveys, the calls that people get that are unsolicited, becoming bigger and bigger challenges to get past. I'm not sure what we're going to find is the most economical or the best method of trying to get more people to participate, because I think it's becoming a bigger challenge because people want their privacy. They don't want to be bothered by surveys. Robocalls, or at least in some cases, maybe going down, but not all cases. So I don't know what magic bullet you have to try to help us get these numbers up, but I think it's going to continue to be a challenge as we move forward, that more and more is going to electronic and less mail. If the post office doesn't do something, they're going to not have anybody to deliver the mail to anyway. All right, Mr. Lindsay, is there anything you need from council at this time?
I don't believe so. Appreciate your attention and your thoroughness in reviewing this this evening, and also again thank you to the project team, Teresa and Lori and Michelle. Really appreciate the work that's been done on this.
All right, everyone, we're going to take a short bio break, and then we'll come back and wrap up with our discussion on the COVID-19 response. We'll take about no more than 5 minutes if you can, folks, and we'll be right back. So right now we're on a recess.
I'm not bio break. We could all take pictures.
Just saying. Well, fine. I'll come down and close the windows.
Thank you, Ms. Scully.
Oh, did not realize I was not on mute. Sorry.
All right, Ms. Fitch, would you survey the council and see if everyone's back?
Yes, sir. Mayor Atchison,
Yes.
Councilor Demott.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Sites. Councilor Seymour.
Here.
Councilor Scully.
Here.
Councilor Smith.
Present.
And Councilor Bowles.
Here.
Okay,
Did you get a response from Ms. Sykes?
I did. It was a little jumbled. So Mayor Pro Tem Sites, are you there?
I am here. My thing was muting me and unmuting me in like 1 second increments, so I couldn't. It seems to be working now. That was very weird.
Okay, we've got everyone back for the record.
I think everyone is.
Okay, I think you've got everyone covered. Mr. Tripp, we have item 3, discussion on the COVID-19 and next steps. And then before you go there, let me give council some information that I received while we've been on the call. The governor has announced a new round of safer at home guidelines that are out for review. They're at the www.coloradosaferat-home.com. The draft guidelines are open for comments for the next 48 hours. They will be finalized on Thursday, June the 18th, and it looks like we will receive a new order probably on Friday the 19th or over the weekend. Mr. Tripp, go ahead.
So Mayor and members of council, we have a rather short COVID agenda report tonight. We have 3 items, and we had some discussion. I'm not sure whether Max is doing 2 of the 3 or he's getting some support from Larry, but so I'll just tell you what they are, and I'll ask the staff to jump in and make their short updates to you. The first is going to be facility openings, and the second is going to be COVID expenditures to date, and the third is going to be a long-term recovery, economic recovery update with John Hall, supported by Larry. On the facility openings, I want you to pay particular close attention to this because there's some new information this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you, Mr. Tripp. This is Max Kirschbaum, Public Works and Utilities Director. As we've been talking about with you over the last couple of weeks, as the activity in the EOC has continued to ramp itself down, that same level and energy on some of the same activities has moved over to long-term recovery. And you'll hear a little bit more about long-term recovery in the other items following this EOC update. So I'm really only going to highlight one item from an EOC perspective, and that is facility reopenings that have been approved by the city manager's office and the policy group since we last spoke with you a week ago. And there has been just one change on that. Just today, the process for the approval of PRLs, field rentals, and permits, which describes more of a process and a method than it does a specific facility, because it pertains to a lot of the turf fields that are used for various programs and by various leagues and organizations throughout the city. So subject to the continuing requirements for maximum numbers and social distancing and all the requirements that still apply, at least that process is beginning to reopen for field rentals. We have several different facility reopenings that are in the process of review. Some of those involve paddlecraft and camping activity at Stanley Lake. We'll be looking further this week at the Countryside Pool, and then a couple office type reopenings, including the Municipal Service Center Annex, and a somewhat generic plan to address the remainder of city's recreation facilities. So those are the 4 or 5 that are next in line for review, and by this time next week, I may have additional reopening activity that I can report to you, as long as the trend on number of cases statewide and in the 2 counties continues to follow its current path, which is on a declining trend. That's all I have for you this evening, unless you have any questions.
Comments or questions from council? Ms. Smith?
Thank you. I don't know if I had missed it, but could you give an update? I write down all of the expenditures that you have said over the weeks, as well as the number of cases that we have in Westminster. If you went over it, I'm sorry I missed it. But if you could go over that, that would be helpful for me.
The expenditure information is part of what rolls over from the EOC and the situation reporting that we've been doing into long-term recovery. So I think you'll get some insight following this, the EOC part, as it relates to expenditures. And in terms of case data, once again, we will continue to report that information on a weekly basis. And I think you'll see that again. There was not a situation report today, but you'll see it again in 1 week's time. I can tell you that over the course of the last 7 days, the trend, which is what we're following with cases and with case reporting as it is through the state and through the counties, in all 3 cases, state, Jefferson County, and Adams County, that the trend line is continuing on downward. And that information, I don't have it off the top of my head, but it is posted and will continue to be posted on the website.
Does that answer your question for now, Ms. Smith?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Mr. Seymour?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to clarify as I was writing my notes. So in this last week, the one change we have is an update to the process on field rentals. Is that correct?
Yes, it's the permitting system that allows the use of all of the turf fields throughout the city by the various leagues, associations, youth sports, etc. So that was also provided to you in a lengthier note in today's daily update, and the field rental and permit process will open up starting Wednesday.
Okay, that was my question. So I appreciate that. I didn't have a chance to get to that email tonight.
Thank you.
All right,
that's all, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the next on the expenditures.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is Larry Dorr, Chief Financial Officer and Deputy City Manager. And Ms. Smith, I'll just really quickly answer the question. Is $373,580. $373,580. And of note, related to that, is that our team has been working towards our first submission for FEMA public assistance, and we anticipate making that submission very shortly. I'll continue to provide this expenditure update, and I'll highlight anything of particular interest and do a week-to-week comparison for the council as this comes about during our weekly updates. With that, I just want to transition to our discussion bullet number 3, unless there are any questions, and of course we can come back to that. But under economic recovery update, I want to introduce a subject related to our CARES Act funding, and hence I'm making a little bit of an introduction here, because the proposal, the vision for this is that CARES funds would be utilized under economic recovery, which was one of the 4 guiding principles that council set forth during our CARES discussions. And what we know is that the restaurant industry is just such a critical part of the Westminster economy, and frankly the Westminster community as well in whole. We know that that industry is responsible for a lot of jobs, both direct and secondary jobs. We know that everything that is sold in restaurants is subject to sales taxes, which, as you heard earlier from Ms. Hitchens, is majority of our operating revenue to provide services. And as I said, indirect, restaurants create so much foot traffic in our community that also drives sales at neighboring retail. Folks who go out to a restaurant might, before or after their dining, visit other retail establishments. So we know that the restaurant industry is just so critical to our economy that we have on deck. I'm going to introduce our Director of Economic Development, John Hall, who will describe a little bit further a proposal to really inject some energy and funds and resources into our restaurant industry in Westminster. He'll describe that a little bit further. There's nothing additional for council to undertake, no resolutions, no ordinances, no appropriations going forward, but we would seek your informal consensus. So Mayor, if you would assist us in testing that after John's description, we'll make sure that this makes sense. We've got some mobilization done, and because of our earlier work related to CARES and related to appropriations, we would be able to launch this program forward starting first thing in the morning, frankly. So with that, let me introduce John Hall for a few additional, or excuse me, for the overview of this particular program related to CARES. Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Pleasure to talk to you again tonight. And by way of introduction, Larry has laid out things very well, but I want to just add a little bit as we propose to you a couple of new programs to assist in economic recovery, specifically focused around restaurants and focused around our residents as well. Matt, I believe you have some slides that you could pull up. Thank you very much. If you could go to the next slide, please. The first program that I want to talk to you about this evening is what we're calling the Westy Rise and Dine Business Grant Program. And last week, I believe I spoke to you about the possibility of this program coming forward, and really the program being a follow-up to a series of events that have taken place as the restaurant industry has attempted to reopen. So, of course, the first thing that happened in that series was the state lifting its limitations and restrictions on the ability of bars and restaurants to function. Specifically, they allowed for 50% for indoor dining, equivalent to 50% of indoor capacity. They also encouraged restaurants to work with their local jurisdictions to find ways to accommodate outdoor dining. The second step in that series of events then was the emergency directive issued by City Manager Tripp that allowed for changes to our code and to our policies and procedures, allowing us to then come to you with the temporary expanded food and beverage service area concepts. And all of that is in place now. We have seen about 20 restaurants avail themselves of the temporary expanded food and beverage service areas, although we know that there are many more who are in the process and will continue to move forward with expansion of dining areas. The final piece then is to assist our local restaurants by providing some financial assistance when they have been mandated to, when they've suffered a decline in sales because of public health orders, or they've suffered an increased cost associated with regulatory changes, allowing them to operate more forcefully. So next slide, please, Matt, if you could. So the need then is that our restaurants are suffering, and while most are open, business is down, and they are seeking ways to comply with public health orders while at the same time serving their patrons safely. So the purpose of the Westy Rise and Dine Business Grant Program would be to provide grants to Westminster restaurants and to help these local businesses protect local jobs, generate sales tax for the community. We are proposing $500,000 from CARES Act funding, as Deputy City Manager Dorr indicated. However, no formal allocation requirement is, no formal allocation steps are required on the part of council. Next slide, please. Some of the specifics of the program: it would provide a one-time grant to Westminster restaurants and bars for eligible costs. That grant maximum would be $10,000. Eligible costs would include monthly rental and mortgage obligations, the cost of or purchase of rental equipment and supplies needed to expand dining services, the construction of temporary or permanent structures needed to maintain safe social distancing, and then it is possible that the $10,000 grant could be used for any combination of these three activities. Next slide, please. The eligibility criteria should look very familiar to you. They must be a business operating a restaurant or bar within Westminster. Reduction in sales due to the public health orders, which every restaurant and bar qualifies given the nature of the public health orders. Had to have been in operation for at least 6 months prior to application for assistance. And they must be open to the public as of the application date. Businesses having multiple locations may apply. However, the $10,000 maximum still is in place, and they have to have an active business license, be in good standing with the city and with the state as of March 1st, 2020. Next slide, please. Second program we are proposing this evening is the Westy Rise Restaurant and Food Security Program. So why is this necessary in addition to the Restaurant Assistance Program? Well, we see this as a way of simultaneously assisting restaurants as they attempt to survive and assisting residents who may be suffering from food insecurity. So both restaurants need support and our residents need support. So in general, this would allow the city to form partnerships with local restaurants for food preparation and delivery, while at the same time partnering with local nonprofits to provide food to their clients. Next slide, please. So we would partner with local restaurants. We would pay those restaurants a fixed cost so that they can budget, hire, and order supplies to meet demand. We would also partner with area nonprofits to ensure meals are delivered to those in need. And we would require that each partner meet food production and delivery safety standards. We would also allow that the city may purchase shelf-stable foods from partner restaurants to help support the needs of area food banks. Proposed funding amount here is $540,000, and the source of funding is also the CARES Act. So two separate programs, one providing direct general assistance to our restaurants, the others supporting a restaurant network that in turn provides much needed food to residents of our community. The second program, the Westy Rise restaurant and food security program is partially our own thinking. It's also partly based on experience from other communities that have gone through disasters. And Greg Moss has had some experience with this program during Hurricane Katrina. So if there are more specific questions about the second program, both of us can answer those. We're looking for your informal consensus tonight to move forward. We do have staff ready to implement these programs and begin assisting our local businesses. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Before I turn to the council, Mr. Hall, I know this, an advance notice of what these were came out to us last Friday. And I presented it when I talked to the chamber this morning that this would be coming up for discussion tonight. One of the things that I indicated on the call with the chamber this morning is that we had, or I had, some information that came in from the city and county of Denver that the restaurants that have been surveyed down there, that they got a feedback that 56% of the restaurants surveyed indicated that they could not get back to full capacity. I mean, 100% of their capacity being available to them to use. That 56% said they would probably not be in business any more than another 90 days. Do we have anything like that that we're getting feedback from our local restaurants?
Mayor, we've done a couple of things to try and get a handle on not only the number of restaurants that are open, but the level of business that they're doing. And what we're seeing is that there is a relatively high number of restaurants that are open. However, they're not doing a great deal of business, certainly nothing compared to what they were doing prior to the advent of COVID, prior to the advent of social distancing requirements. Most are doing a third of what they had previously been doing. So while they may be open, they currently are not enjoying the level of business activity that they had prior to the advent of COVID.
The other question that came up on that conversation this morning was how do restaurants become partners in this second activity you're showing, that several of them on the call this morning were very interested in becoming partners?
Well, should council decide to move forward on this, we would then begin entertaining discussions with local restaurants. We'd like those restaurants, quite frankly, we're going to be looking at the geography and the transportation availability to move meals from restaurants to places where they are needed. But they can certainly contact myself if they're interested in becoming part of the program, and we'll be going through an evaluation process based on the number of restaurants that are interested and where the need is located.
Okay, we have several members of council have questions or comments, so I'll start with them in order. Ms. Scully.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is just a tremendous program. I am just so impressed. And I know that Councilor Voles really had a big hand in this. So I appreciate Councilor Voles working with you, John, and making this happen. My question is, and you might have addressed it, and I apologize if I've missed it, but how would residents be able to put their name forward to receive this food?
Thank you for the question, Councilor Scully. I'm going to ask if Greg Moss is on the line, that perhaps if Greg, you could talk a little bit about the mechanics of how both a network on the restaurant side could work, what you're seeing, what you've seen in some of the best practices, and then how people interface through some of our nonprofit organizations.
You bet. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Councilor Scully, for that question. So let me back up and give you just a kind of a high level preview as well. So we are working off the playbook for the World Central Kitchen Restaurants for People program, Great Plates Delivered, the home meals for seniors, and frontline foods. So again, we're going to work closely with their playbooks, and we have already, to kind of identify how we will work specifically with the restaurants and the the needs that we need to make sure are connected directly to our nonprofits. So the nonprofit partners will be the ones who select the people who are most in need of the food, and we will, of course, rely on them to identify the most vulnerable populations and where the food insecurity is greatest within our community. And that will also kind of help establish which restaurants in specific geographic areas, really targeting the locally owned restaurants, not large chains or franchises necessarily, who we will want to probably work with most closely, at least in this first phase. Did that help answer your question?
It absolutely did. This is just such a tremendous community effort. I'm totally impressed. I know during COVID we had some businesses that helped their employees by providing gift cards and providing delivery of meals to their families once or twice a week. And I know how valued it was. I had some friends that were recipients of that, and I also know what a great help it was, and what a way to really boost morale during this very dark time in our history. So thank you. I'm really blown away with this. Thank you so much.
Mr. DeMott.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just curious, and maybe you kind of just touched on this, but as far as the food banks and stuff, how are we choosing which ones we partner with and which ones do we have in the city? I know we do Upgrowing Homes, but there's other food banks in the city that have been working hard through these weeks. There's the Westminster Cares group that works with the faith-based community. How are we deciding who we're working with through this program?
Thank you, Councilor DeMott. Greg, would you like to talk a little bit about that process as well?
You bet. So thank you, Councilor DeMont. It's a great question. And what we will do is not only work with Growing Home and their food pantry program, but to identify all of the food banks. We would envision working very closely with Kate Scarbeck, who has been on the EOC, working very closely with Max and his team in identifying all the food banks who are in need in our community. So that's both on the Jeffco and the Adams County side as well, just to point that out. So we'll be working closely with all of them to make sure they're well represented.
That's great. So thank you for all the work on these programs, and thank you actually to those community partners as well that have been working hard prior to this, since they always work hard really to serve our communities, but they've been working overtime, I feel, and in this circumstance with COVID. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor DeMott asked my question regarding how we are choosing our nonprofits, and then Councilor Scully kind of got into the rest of my question. So thank you for all that you're doing on this, and greatly appreciate it. It seems like a great effort that we're working with our great partnership that we're working with our nonprofits and our local businesses. So thank you.
Ms. Sykes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have to say, I was really shocked and chilled a little bit when I saw some restaurant institutions in Boulder have said they will not reopen, the Med and Brazier 1010. And just really, I also saw that article that the mayor referenced, that 56% of restaurants in Denver don't plan to stay open longer than, I believe it was 3 months if they can't get to at least 75% capacity. So I appreciate you. I think you're absolutely correct. This is a very vulnerable portion of our economy, and one that's incredibly important to our sales tax base, and then also to our community. I mean, there's a reason we put chef-owned restaurants in the strategic plan, is they really do help with that place building and sense of community. So I really value your work in this area. I do have questions. I do want to just make sure that we're whatever criteria we put forth for partner restaurants in order to evaluate and select them. I just want to make sure that there's no feeling of favoritism, and I know you wouldn't. I know this would be absolutely clear, but I just want to, for the record, emphasize how important it'll be. Like, this it'll be that people recognize this is an opportunity that everybody has the opportunity to compete for, and understands how they will be evaluated. Because I have a feeling that $540,000 for the second program will go fast.
Mayor Pro Tem Sites, thank you for the comment. And what I would say is that clearly with the Westie Rise and Dine program, which is available to any restaurant and is grant assistance, there is an opportunity for all to apply. And just a reminder, we will be back, or I will be back every single Monday night, and I'm happy to provide updates on how we're doing in our dialogues with restaurants, who's expressing an interest in being involved, how we're doing with our nonprofits, and how this is all coming together. We fully recognize that this is, while a creative solution, it's also a challenging one to organize and put together. So we're happy to be completely transparent about the process and with you in dialogue about how this comes together.
Well, I do want to say again, thank you for being innovative and creative and having an eye for, I recognize this is going to be a lot to juggle in implementation, but I think it's well worth it. Food insecurity is something that I know we are all concerned about with the record levels of unemployment. So thank you for looking for a way to achieve two goals with one program.
Mr. Voles.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also want to say this is a couple outstanding programs that I will wholeheartedly support. So I'll say that ahead of time. I do want to correct the record, though. I have not helped. I appreciate Councilor Scully calling me out. I haven't helped with specifically this program. I think that's more the Human Services Board as liaison in that role. I've been involved in a couple things there. So I just want to correct the record on that a little bit. The innovation here in the food insecurity and finding a solution like this is outstanding. So thank you for your work on this team. I appreciate it very much. And whatever I need to do to voice my strong support for this, I will do. Thank you.
Mr. Seymour.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too want to thank everyone involved in both of these programs. The business community is very appreciative of what the city is doing to help stabilize their efforts. But I also want to throw out a personal challenge to my peers to put their money where their mouth is. And I think it's time for us to show leadership and start shopping local ourselves at restaurants. And as much as possible, and as you feel comfortable, go out and personally promote those. We were on a couple great patios this weekend with the fabulous Colorado weather. So I challenge everyone out there to go out there and put the money on the table instead of through another delivery service.
Mr. Voles, you had another comment?
Yes, I do. And I want to say challenge accepted. I've been doing that all along as well. I maybe don't post it as much to Facebook as some of my colleagues, but I've been doing that as well. So challenge accepted. And that's a good challenge. Thank you, Councilor Seymour.
Well, from my standpoint, I can tell you my wife appreciates me picking up dinner or taking her to dinner at every opportunity. That means she doesn't have to cook. But I think many of us are trying to do it. If you're comfortable being out in restaurants, some may not be yet, but those that are, I've been doing it since we've been able to get back out, trying to get out a couple of times a week, either through pickup or dining in. And I will tell you, most of the restaurants I've been in have been very particular about making sure that they're in compliance. They don't want to have issues about having reopened and then have to close down. But to that end, at the request of the staff, I'm going to propose a question to the council. And in regards to the two programs, the first program is the Rise and Dine Business Grant Program. If there's any council member who has an objection to staff moving forward with this program, please let me know now. All right, Mr. Hall, you're okay with program number 1. The second program, the Westy Rise Restaurant and Food Security Program. If there's any member of council who does not support this, please signify now. Mr. Hall, hearing no objection to either program, please launch these as soon as possible and keep us informed.
Thank you, Mayor and Council.
Mr. Tripp, back to you. Anything else on the COVID updates that you have?
No, sir. I want to thank the council tonight for your great questions and for your support. It's very much appreciated.
All right, that concluding the business of the night for tonight is approximately 9:14. At this point, we are done with the business of the city council for June 15th. Just a reminder to the public, we will be in session one more night this month, the 5th Monday. To my understanding from the city manager, we will not be in session. So we have next week will be our city council meeting. We will continue to meet virtually, and we wish everyone a safe and good night. We are adjourned.